Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today in this module we are going to talk about coastal ecology. Ecologist Rachel Carson in her book Under Sea writes, and I quote, "Between the low water and the flotsam and the jetsam of the high tide mark, land and sea wage a never-ending conflict for possession." Unquote. Rachel Carson's words suggest to us the fundamental changeable and unstable nature of coastal ecology. In recent decades, this instability has been further compounded by the effects of climate change. Meanwhile, the conflict for possession is no longer just between the land and the sea, but has been joined by a range of development actors hungry for space and resources. This module will describe India's coastal ecology, the factors posing a threat to this ecology, and the history of policy and legislative efforts to define and project this zone. India's 7,500 kilometers long coastline contains a diversity of geomorphological features, ecosystems, and living and non-living resources. There are also human communities which have adapted to these systems and resources and depend upon them in various ways for their livelihoods, primary among these being the fishing communities. This section, drawn largely from MOEF 2005, will describe these features and resources as well as the activities putting pressure on them or damaging them. Let us start with getting a sense of various land and seascapes, that is, the geomorphological features of the coastline, keeping in mind their inherent changeability. These include beaches, sand dunes, earth and rock cliffs, rocky foreshores, estuaries, lagoons, lakes, mud banks, mud flats, deltas, sand marshes, barrier islands, and islands. Beaches are the geomorphic form most popularly associated with the coastline. The shape and size of beaches varies with deposits and accretion of sand. The 2004 tsunami changed the size and shape of many of the beaches on the southeast coast. Beaches are used by fishing communities for activities related to fishing, such as storing craft and drying fish. They are also prime tourist attractions. Beach sand is often taken illegally as construction aggregates. In some areas, it is mined for rare minerals, and in others, it is dredged for purpose of harbors, etc. Alongside or close to beaches, one may find another distinct form, the sand dunes. This may be vegetated or without vegetation and has several benefits. It can act as a protection for supply and recharge of freshwater aquifers in coastal areas, as a habitat for plants and animals, and protect the coast from tidal surges and large waves, including tsunami waves. Like beaches, sand dunes may be destroyed by mining or by leveling for the purposes of construction, including for roads, railways, and tourist facilities. Not all parts of the coastline are sandy. Instead, there may occur earth cliffs or rocky cliffs and rocky foreshores where the coastal region is mountainous or at least rugged. These are important as for aesthetic purposes as well as for protecting coastal habitation and construction. Mud flats, also called tidal flats, are formed by the sedimentation of organic and inorganic matter and are found in sheltered parts of the coastline. They are the feeding grounds of migratory birds and also help to control floods and stabilize the coast. As distinct from mud flats are the more transient mud banks, which are accumulation of sediments which form close to the shore yearly along the west coast of southern India soon after the arrival of southwest monsoon in late May or June. They help to dampen waves and provide a calmer space within which to fish during the rough monsoon season. They are also biologically fertile and have an abundance of organic matter which makes them attractive to fish which feed on them, but they can erode the coast as they form and disappear. In addition to various formations created by sand, mud, or rock, one may see various types of water bodies as well as landforms shaped or drained by water. An estuary is a semi-enclosed body of water or a channel which contains the ocean and the river, thus containing sea water diluted with fresh water. There are some 100 estuaries along India's coast, most of them, and the larger ones being on the east coast, for example, Sagar. The extent of flow in the estuaries is determined by the tidal cycle and range, so that the water in them may be variable, more saline or fresh. These waters are highly productive because the habitat is sheltered but receives a constant supply of nutrients. They nurture mangroves and seagrasses as well as clams and mussels and other molluscs. They help to flush away pollutants, control the salinity of groundwater, and absorb floods and wave energy. They help, but estuaries are increasingly being damaged due to reclamation, urban and industrial effluents, reduction in freshwater discharge due to dams, and dredging for waterways. Lagoons are another type of coastal water body. They are shallow bodies of brackish water or sea water partially separate from the adjacent sea by barriers of sand or shingle. Coastal lagoons are usually found on low-lying coasts. Many of their uses as well as the factors affecting them are similar to estuaries. The series of connected lagoons along the coast of Kerala are densely populated on their islands and are also a highly scenic tourist route. Deltas are formed where riverine and marine systems meet. Among the best known are the Hooghly Delta at the mouth of the Ganges and the Kaveri Delta near Thanjavur in Tamil Nadu. Deltas have highly fertile soil and are densely settled for purpose of agriculture, but they are vulnerable to reclamation and flooding. Tidal inlets form where flows from terrestrial water bodies meet with the sea, thus facilitating the mixing of water, sediments, nutrients and organisms between terrestrial and marine environments. They also serve as routes between inland harbors and the open sea. Coastal lakes are large water bodies that are influenced by the ocean tides. Best known among these are Chilika Lake in Odisha and Lake Pulicat on the border of Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh. They are breeding and spawning areas for a variety of fish and shellfish and thus make for rich fishing grounds. Salt marshes are grassland or dwarf brushwoods on alluvial soil sediments bordering saline water bodies whose water level fluctuates due to tides and other water movements. These form the habitat for variety of flora and fauna, act as buffer zones during floods and storms, and help recharge fresh groundwater. They are vulnerable to reclamation and removal of marsh vegetation for agriculture and construction of embankments. Islands are also important coastal geomorphological forms. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands in the Bay of Bengal consist of 325 islands, of which 38 are inhabited. The Lakshadweep Islands, some 400 km off the southwest coast of India, are an archipelago of 36 tiny islands, of which 10 are inhabited. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands have forest and hilly terrains and are marked by bays, lagoons, creeks and reefs. The Lakshadweep Islands are coral atoll formations. Both sets of islands have enormous tourism potential and are also fishing sites. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands are also home to indigenous communities whose livelihoods and ways of life are threatened by the increased use of these islands for a variety of developmental purposes, tourism, fishing, military base. These geomorphological landscapes and seascapes contain a variety of ecosystems. Mangroves consist of a number of species of trees and shrubs that grow on land but are adapted to survive in sheltered shores in the intertidal zones, such as on tidal flats, deltas, estuaries, bays, creeks and islands. The trees range from the dwarf varieties found in the Gulf of Kutch to the tall trees of the Sundarbans. There are still significant mangroves in the Sundarbans in West Bengal, the Mahanadi Delta in Bhitarkanika in Odisha, the Krishna and Godavari Delta in Andhra Pradesh, the coastal Andaman and Nicobar Islands, the coastal reefs and the coast of Gulf of Kutch in Gujarat, the deltaic region of the Kori Creek in Gujarat and the Pichavaram Vedranyam area of Tamil Nadu. The mangroves harbor a rich community of life at all stages of the food chain, from plankton and other microorganisms, attached animals like barnacles, bivalves and worms, mollusks, crustaceans and fish, to insect, lizards, snakes and birds. Many of the fish and shellfish species found here are commercially important, such as prawns, mackerel, mullet, and bream. The Sundarbans, the largest single block of tidal holophytic mangroves in the world, are also home to the Royal Bengal tiger as well as crocodiles. In addition to nurturing a host of life, mangroves are important for stabilizing the shorelines and acting as a buffer against storms, cyclones, and tsunamis. As recently as the late 80s, mangroves covered some 6,740 square kilometers of India's coastline. By the early 2000s, this figure had shrunk to 4,120 square kilometers, as mangroves have been cleared to make way for industry, agriculture, and aquaculture. Mangroves have been further destroyed by the chemical fertilizers and pesticides used in shrimp aquaculture. The reduction in freshwater flow due to damming or dredging, or in tidal flow due to sea walls, bunds, and other coastal structures have both the effect of destroying the delicate saline freshwater balance in which the mangroves thrive. While the fuel and fodder needs of communities who have traditionally dwelt in or close to the mangroves are often blamed for the destruction of the mangroves, the greatest threat to this ecosystem has come from the external pressures related to economic development. Coral reefs are another productive and complex coastal ecosystems. They occur in shallow tropical waters where the sea water is clean, clear, and warm, framed by coral animals and microscopic algae. Although the waters in which they form are not nutrient rich, the corals have a high capacity to recycle scarce nutrients. The coral reefs are aesthetic marvels with limestone in striking colors and are the habitat for a rich variety of fish, other sea animals, and plants, including in many cases mangroves. Reefs can serve as places where fish aggregate to spawn and feed. They are also natural barriers against erosion and storm surges. In India, coral reefs are found mainly in the Andaman and Nicobar and Lakshadweep Islands, as well as in the Pok Bay, Gulf of Mannar, Gulf of Kutch, and Malawan coast. Coral reefs are constantly being dredged by natural factors such as storms, but the bigger source of destruction is anthropogenic. Chemical pollution from agricultural runoff, aquaculture, industrial effluents or discharge from ships, sewerage from settlements, thermal plants, destructive fishing practices like trawling, dredging and mining, tourism and coral collections. Seagrasses and seaweeds are also important ecosystems, with seagrasses providing habitats for fish and shellfish life and stabilizing effects on the shoreline, while seaweeds are important resources as well as habitats. Coastal forests found along the Western Ghats and to a lesser extent on the east coast in Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu constitute yet another ecosystem sheltering wildlife and protecting shorelines from erosion, cyclones, and flooding. Certain parts of the coastline are important as nesting grounds for crabs and for turtles, with three major mass nesting sites of the olive ridley turtle to be found in Odisha. The one at Gahirmata, part of the Bhitarkanika sanctuary, is the largest sea turtle rookery in the world, with 1 lakh to 5 lakh turtles nesting there each year. The other two at the mouth of Devi River north of Puri and in Rushikulya in Ganjam district are smaller. 4 other species of sea turtles also nest on the Indian coast, and the coastal waters contain some 40 species of marine mammals including sea cows, dolphins, humpback whales. The coastal waters contain a wealth of fish and seafood which has traditionally been harvested by close to 4,000 fishing communities dotted across coastline who depend on fishing and related activities for their livelihood. For the majority of them, fish is also major source of protein and thus vital to their food security. Fishing was traditionally carried out using a large variety of craft and gear. The increased use of more intensive fishing technologies in recent decades, such as trawlers, craft powered by high-speed engines, and eco-sounders, has increased the pressure on the fish resources. A number of fish species are now exploited at near optimal or below optimal level. The fish resources are also being affected by pollution and habitat destruction and degradation. In addition to the depletion of the main sources of their livelihood, fishing communities who require coastal land for a variety of uses, from docking and launching their craft and storing their gear to landing their catch, boat construction and repair, auction of fish, net repair, nurseries and grow out ponds, etc. face displacement on land as it becomes increasingly desired for tourism, urban development, industry and ports and harbors. Finally, it is important to note that the coastal area also contains certain non-living resources. Salt pans may be found in parts of Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh. In Gujarat, chemical industries which use salt for the raw material have come up close to the pans and increased the demand for salt. Too many salt pans can cause saline ingress into groundwater, destruction of mangroves and mudflats, and occupational hazard to workers in constant contact with highly concentrated brine solution. Placers and other minerals such as ilmenite, monazite, zircon, magnetite, and high and heavy minerals are reported to be available in several states but are being mined in Kerala and southernmost Tamil Nadu by Indian rare earths. Hydrocarbons, oil and natural gas found mostly in inland and shallow offshore areas, Bombay High, Gulf of Kutch, Godavari Basin of Andhra Pradesh. While these are of obvious economic value, drilling for them can have harmful environmental effect, including from oil leaks. One may draw certain overall conclusions from this section. First, several of the geomorphological features and ecosystems perform important ecosystem services, that is, they contribute in different ways to the stability and health of the coastal areas, including terms of protecting human life and habitations from storms and other perturbations. Second, they are crucial habitats for a wealth of plant and animal life, much of which in turn contribute to ecological sustainability and the stability of the food chain. Third, these natural forms and living and non-living elements of this zone constitute important resources for human food security, livelihood, recreation and economic development. Fourth, the increased demand for these resources in recent decades for such purposes as resource-intensive aquaculture, industries, thermal and nuclear plants, highways, ports, special economic zones, tourism and urban development is leading to a rapid loss of these resources and threatening the long-term sustainability. Finally, because these resources often have different, often competing value and uses for different groups of people, the coastal ecology is increasingly subject to a high degree of contestation between multiple stakeholders. These conclusions lead us to the next section. How do we ensure the health, stability and sustainability of coastal ecology given these diverse pressures on it? Delimiting coastal ecologies, issues and challenges. Protecting any ecology as extensive, fluid and complex as that of the coastal area raises a number of difficult questions. How should we delineate that which is to be protected? What are its boundaries and how far do they stretch? Who is responsible for this protection? That is, who has jurisdiction and who has rights? For what purpose is it being protected? What techniques should we use to measure and map different features and vulnerabilities to be protected? And finally, what approaches and methods should we use to protect them? This section will discuss the conceptual, perspectival and institutional issues at the heart of these questions, drawing extensively on the anthropologist Bonnie Mackay's brilliant observations in a keynote speech she made some years ago. Mackay writes, and I quote, "The coast has fluid and often difficult to define boundaries. It is dynamic and subject to intense natural and socio-economic pressures, and therefore coasts have features that pose challenges to societies seeking to control and benefit from the coasts through institutions such as property and resource management." Unquote. The landward boundary of the coast, the shore, changes diurnally and seasonally with the tides, more dramatically with the floods, tsunamis or rise of the sea level, and human structures that affect various geomorphological forms along the shore. The effective definition of the coastal zone may change according to these shifts. In the USA, for instance, because of the increased extreme weather events like storms and hurricanes, insurance companies now describe the coastal zone as one of the quote-unquote uninsurable risk and danger. And in the last decade have attempted to increase this uninsurable zone from 1,000 feet to 1 mile, thus shifting the burden for emergency assistance to the government and increasing the cost for fishing families of living on the shore. Likewise, on the seaward side, should the boundary be set at 12 miles from the shore we currently define the territorial sea, or the 200-mile exclusive economic zone demarcated for each coastal state under the 1982 law of the Sea Conference, or should the boundaries instead be based on large marine ecosystems defined by ecological and oceanographic phenomena such as continental shelves and offshore banks? The latter may be the definition favored by the ecosystem approach increasingly advocated since UNCED conference of 1992, which calls for measures to be aimed at protection of the entire ecosystems rather than a particular space, that is of the boundaries of the exclusive economic zones, and these LMEs do not coincide, and they are further complicated by marine protected areas, spawning and breeding grounds of particular species, and the movement of the currents, fish, boats, nutrients and carbon. This can be seen in the challenge of managing deep sea species that straddle EEZs or are highly migratory, such as the world's highest value fish, the bluefin tuna. The Atlantic bluefin tuna ranges from the equator to Newfoundland, from Turkey to the Gulf of Mexico. A single Pacific tuna was tracked crossing the Pacific Ocean 3 times, covering a distance of 25,000 miles. The traveling tuna point to the difficulty of identifying and limiting the effects of geographically distant phenomena on any given ecosystem. The rising sea levels leading to the submergence of small islands and atolls have their origin in the greenhouse gases emitted in countries very distant from the tropical waters in which this submergence is taking place. When the Adivasis protesting displacement from the Narda Valley by the Sada Sarovar Dam and the fish workers protesting declining fish resources caused at least in part by the destruction of habitat due to processes of silting and nutrient loss created by the dam's upstream came together to found the National Alliance of People's Movement in 1989, they realized that life of the fish in the sea depends on the health of the rivers and the forests deep inland. More often, boundaries are set as much by law or administrative decisions as by any inherent ecological features. Complicating the fluidity of ecological boundaries is the overlap and lack of clarity of political and administrative jurisdictions. The Indian coast is governed variously and multiply by the national government. The governments of the 9 coastal states, numerous urban municipalities, and over 4,000 rural panchayats, as well as several smaller fishing hamlets with local bodies set up to regulate access to the fishery, as well as local authorities such as those managing a particular port, labor or thermal plant. Property as a legal or customary institution is yet another way of apportioning of the rights, that is use rights and responsibilities for protection. But property rights in the coast are notoriously hard to establish. While privately held land such as that acquired by tourism companies or industrial units may be easiest to defend in law, it is often the case that it is within a system of private property that it is easiest to externalize the costs. For instance, chemical pollution or the soil or salination of fresh groundwater by salt ponds or aquaculture affects of the entire local population and ecosystems of the region. Rather than seeking rights through legal title, the fishing and other coastal communities base their claims on the history of use and stewardship. They put forward the idea of the coastal commons, the coast and the inshore seas as the common property resources to be managed and used sustainably by those who have evolved local institutions over generations to do so. There is no internationally agreed upon definition of what constitutes the coastal zone as an area to be protected, or on what basis this area is to be identified and demarcated. For instance, of a range of developed and developing countries surveyed for best practices in Swaminathan Committee report, only the United States has a Coastal Zone Management Act. Whereas others deal with issues of fisheries, land conservation and development, flora and fauna, etc. under a range of difficult laws and different laws and authorities. What exactly constitutes the coastal zone varies. In the USA, for instance, it includes the coastal water up to 3 miles from the shore and a flexible land boundary as required to protect the sea from the effect of land-based activities and to deal with the sea level rise. The scientific methods used to demarcate the area to be protected also vary, with the states using exclusively or in combination with each other methods such as zoning. That is, setting aside different zones as appropriate to different activities such as flood control, fishing, habitat protection, recreation, sand mining and industrial use. Vulnerability maps, that is based on the rate of erosion and flooding or vulnerability to natural disasters. And setback zones, that is, which identify a distance from the shore based on the extent of risk faced by an area beyond which activities of different kinds such as housing, tourism and polluting industries must be located. International agencies, that is the World Bank, United Nations Environment Programme, OECD, all increasingly emphasize integrated coastal zone management. The integration of development, livelihood, habitation and conservation policies, which was first elaborated in Chapter 17 of 1992, Agenda 21, and several states have adopted this in principle. As seen below, the Indian approach to the coastal zone combines several of these aspects. Coastal zone protection in India, policy and practice. In 1981, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi wrote to the chief ministers of the 9 coastal states asking them to keep free from development a 500-meter zone from the shoreline in the interests of coastal protection. Following this, in 1983, the Ministry of Environment and Forests of the Government of India issued environmental guidelines for development of beaches, asking each coastal state to prepare master plans for the development of its coastal stretches. Finally, in 1991, in the context of growing fisher militancy around the protection of coastal resources, the MOEF issued a coastal regulation zone notification under the EP Act 1986 and Environment Protection Rule 1986, declaring coastal stretches as coastal regulation zones (CRZ), regulating all activities within this area and empowering coastal states to enact provisions of the CRZ notification. The main objective of the notification was stated as being the conservation and better management of the country's rich and diverse coastal resources. Under the notification, the coastal zone was identified as encompassing all that land with which the sea has direct contact and also those portions of the land which the sea has an influence indirectly through tidal action. The CRZ consisted of the landward part of the coastal stretches of open sea, bays, estuaries and any tidal water bodies up to 500 meters from the high tide line, as well as the land between the high tide line and the low tide line. The notification created 4 coastal regulation zones. CRZ1 consisted of ecologically sensitive areas. These were by and large to be no development zones. As an aside, it is worth noting that projects of the Department of Nuclear Energy were permitted in this zone. CRZ2 consisted of areas that were substantially built up, greater than 50% as of 1991, or that had municipalities or town corporations. Here development was permitted on the landward side of the road closest to the shore. The seaward side of the road was largely a no development zone. CRZ3 consisted of areas other than CRZ1 and 2. Here a no development zone was declared up to 200 meters from the high tide line, and then only tourism development was permitted beyond the 200 meter. CRZ4 covered coastal stretches in the Andaman and Nicobar, Lakshadweep and other smaller islands. The regulation prohibited outright a range of activities in the no development zones and permitted only certain activities deemed essential within these zones. Right from the start, industry groups began filing for amendments to the regulation in order to enable construction within demarcated zones, including the no development zones. There were also violations of the regulation without formal seeking of amendments. In 1994, the Indian Society for Enviro-Legal Action filed a public interest litigation in the Supreme Court, seeking the court's intervention in directing the states to comply with its provisions. The writ petition also challenged the validity of the amendments to the main notification of 1991, especially those which sought to provide the central government with discretionary powers to permit any construction within 200 meters no development zone along any part of the coastline. These amendments were sought partly to accommodate the interests of the hotel and tourism industry. The Supreme Court responded in 1996 by giving coastal state governments 6 months in which to prepare management plans for the coastal areas based on the CRZ notification and take necessary steps to implement this. Consequently, all 9 coastal states prepared plans, but with several variations, which were approved by the MOEF. While the notification was seen as too restrictive of development by corporate interests, the long list of amendments, some 25 by the start of the new century, and violations led to a growing sense of its failure on the part of the fishing communities and environmentalists. In the early 2000s, coastal zone governance became part of a larger review of national environmental policy, which resulted in 2006 in a national environment policy. The review's sustainable development framework drew on the 1992 UNCED and on the foundations of a World Bank funded National Environment Action Plan of 1993. These were aimed at strengthening environmental policy planning and administration, making decentralization of environment planning more effective, firming up implementation of environmental law, and toughening monitoring and compliance in specific high priority and environmental problem areas such as mining and coastal zone management. Meanwhile, the EIA process was streamlined to reduce delays and levels of decision making. In line with the recommendations of the 2002 Govindarajan Committee on reforming investment approval and implementation procedure, which had identified delays in environmental clearances as the greatest cause of delays to projects. Under the new process, EIS were to be carried out only at the last stage of project clearances, or even after a project had gained clearance, in order to outline mitigation measures while minimizing the need for a full and multidimensional public consultation. In the year and a half following the issuance of the final revised EIA notification of 2006, 1,736 projects were cleared, whereas in the 20 years preceding this, only 4,016 projects had been given clearance by the MOEF in coastal areas. In July 2004, as part of the review process leading to the new environmental policy and based on the recommendations of the EMCB on the need for integrated coastal zone management, an expert committee chaired by Dr. M.S. Swaminathan was appointed with the mandate to review the 1991 CRZ notification. The Swaminathan committee report was released in early 2005, just months after devastation caused by the Indian Ocean tsunami highlighted the need for effective coastal zone management. The report draws on the recommendations of the past committees on coastal zone regulation, international best practices, recommendations from a range of international agencies including UNCED, UNEP, OECD and the World Bank and the IUCN, scientific principles in coastal management, a listing of coastal resources and hazards, as well as a review of CRZ notification and its implementation to make its recommendations. In its review of the problems with the CRZ notification, it lists lack of clarity around why certain industrial activities are banned and concerns from industries that require particular access to the coast, such as tourism, ports and harbors, noting that in a developing country like India, the coast had many important economic uses, such as for SEZs. Given this, it talks of the need for a more clearly outlined approval procedures for projects. And for monitoring, it notes the dependence of coastal communities for the livelihoods on the coastal zone and talks of how water resources, for instance, have been plundered by commercial interests in the name of permissible human activities. The final chapter of the report consists of action plan which recommends the reclassification of the coastal zone with different activities permitted and prohibited in each, the determination of these activities through state level integrated coastal zone management plans, and the establishment of a new national board for sustainable coastal zone management that would coordinate research and enforcement activities of the state level CZM authorities. In May 2007, a draft of new coastal zone management notification prepared by MOEF became public by virtue of a leak. The notification stated that it was based on the recommendations of the Swaminathan committee report, although there is some debate about this. Unlike the report, the proposed notification intended to replace entirely the CRZ notification in favor of a new management approach. The coastal zone was expanded to include the territorial waters, 12 nautical miles from the shore, instead of just the land. The zone was to be demarcated based on a setback line established by mapping the vulnerabilities to the hazards of each part of the coast using parameters such as elevation, geomorphology, sea level trends, horizontal shoreline displacement, tidal zones with CMZ2 now tidal ranges and wave heights. The earlier CRZ categories were now reclassified into coastal management zones with CMZ2 now including areas that were less built up than under the previous CRZ2. This being the zone with the fewest restrictions on development, it meant that the areas that had previously been classified as CRZ3 and protected from development were now open for development. The category of a no development zone NDZ was removed altogether and a few activities were prohibited outright. Instead, the activities permitted in each zone were to be determined by a state level integrated coastal zone management plan to be drawn up by the state administration and approved by the MOEF. Such a plan was to keep in mind technical feasibilities and costs and be otherwise consistent with the provision of National Environment Policy 2006. All regulations under these plans was to be carried out by state or union territory environment appraisal authorities set up under the provisions of 2006 EIA notification, which were now also to serve as state or union territory coastal zone management authorities. These authorities were to invariably obtain the scientific advice of the state or union territory environment expert committees also set up under the provisions of 2006 EIA notification. The leaked draft CZM notification drew a strong public response which resulted in July 2007 in the formation of a National Coastal Protection Campaign (NCPC) consisting of a range of community-based and civil society organizations including National Fish Workers Forum, Kolkata, Tamil Nadu Pondicherry Fisher People Federation, Chennai, Coastal Action Network, Chennai, Conservation Action Trust, Mumbai, South Indian Federation of Fishermen Societies, Trivandrum, Worldwide Fund for Nature, Delhi, Greenpeace India, Bangalore, International Collective in Support of Fish Workers, Chennai, Gulf Environment Action Group, Delhi, Dakshin Trust, Bangalore, Pondi Citizens Action Network, Pondicherry, Center for Education and Communication, Delhi, and the Research and Information Network for the Coast, Trinet, Chennai. Opponents of the CZM notification charged that it had been developed with no public consultations and made coastal protection subservient to commercial interests. They argued that a management framework with its more flexible arrangements opened up greater space and exploitation than the clearer prohibitions contained under the earlier regulation framework. The rezoning of more areas as CMZ2 from the more restricted CRZ3 and the removal of the no development zones in CMZ1 and 3, making development in these zones subject to an ICZMP, meant that large tracts of coastline were now freed for investment. The ICZMPs were to be developed through partnerships with all stakeholders, including the very corporate actors responsible for violations of the previous CRZ notifications. Projects were to be approved based on EIS, the process for which, as noted earlier, had been streamlined considerably. Implementation was to be carried out by environment appraisal authorities assisted by environmental expert committees, both also constituted under the terms of the streamlined EIA notification of 2006. These replaced the three-tier coastal management zone authorities at the national, state and district level, leaving no credible monitoring mechanisms. The notification was also seen as removing the protections for residents and livelihood rights for the coastal fishing communities provided in the CRZ notification, making them too secondary to commercial development. In CMZ2, where redevelopment of residences had been permitted, there was a concern that real estate developers might use the opportunity to buy out and displace fishing families. On the other hand, in CMZ3, there was a concern that an EIA might deem residential and fishing related activities detrimental while giving permission to purportedly low impact ecotourism. For instance, further, the notification did not take into account questions of boundaries and jurisdiction, whereby the coastal zone competes with other kind of zones such as municipal and district limits, and conflict arise over the jurisdiction of coastal zone management agencies versus town and country planning authorities or panchayats. The panchayats and village authorities of the over 3,000 fishing villages across the coast are especially important here, with the fishing communities insisting that they should have jurisdiction over the areas in which they live, fish and carry out post-harvest activities. A third and related set of concerns had to do with the knowledge claims on which the notification was based. Here, two types of critiques were made. The first was that its prioritization of scientific knowledge and new environmental technologies and its reliance on experts defined strictly in terms of academic qualifications devalued the traditional ecological knowledge of coastal communities. The second had to do with the validity and correctness of the scientific claims on their own terms. The brief definitions of terms like integrated coastal zone management and ecologically sensitive area were deemed vague and inadequate, and other terms with which the notification is papered, such as sustainable development, sound scientific principle, foreshore requiring facility, and basic infrastructure, was seen as so unspecific as to permit all manner of projects. The criteria, topography, habitats, population density, etc., by which the different CMZs were demarcated were challenged. The reliance on hard structures such as sea walls to manage risk was seen as likely to destroy beaches and habitats. Most significantly, the Atri report pointed out that the vulnerability line as the basis on which the setback line was to be identified was erroneous. The line to be mapped was a hazard line, with a vulnerability map requiring more complicated calculations than those described in the notification. Further, the 6 parameters listed as the components of this hazard, that is vulnerability line, were also incomplete. Militant marches, blockades and hunger fasts across the coastal states brought many state governments and MPs online. A parliamentary standing committee appointed to look into the matter recommended that the CZM notification be allowed to lapse. In June 2009, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, then the Minister of Environment and Forests, reappointed Dr. M.S. Swaminathan to head a 4-person expert committee to re-examine the CZM. The report, Final Frontier, was released in July 2009. It spoke strongly of the centrality of the fishing communities to coastal governance and recommended that CZM notification be allowed to lapse and a new notification based on the 1991 CRZ be issued. Following a further series of public consultations held by the Minister between August 2009 and March 2010 in key coastal states, in April 2010, a pre-draft CRZ notification 2010 was put up on the MOEF website in English and the 9 coastal languages. Along with a concept paper for discussion with 30 days for comments, next, a draft CRZ notification 2010 was put up in September 2010 with 60 days for comments. Finally, a new CRZ notification was issued in January 2011. The 2011 CRZ notification largely relates the 1991 CRZ with some new additions from the CZM notification of 2007. It keeps no development zones and the high tide line as the baseline. It further calls for the mapping of the hazard line with the provision that if it is further than 500 meters of the high tide line in CRZ1 areas, that further area would be declared a no development zone. It retains the classification of CRZ except for introducing an additional zone, Zone 4, for the territorial seas, with the islands now reclassified as CRZ5. It contains special provisions for fisherfolk communities. It outlines a clearer process for granting clearances and enforcing violations, noting that violations shall be identified by using the latest appropriate maps, satellite imagery and information technology. It also contains measures to ensure transparency in the working of the state-level coastal zone management authorities, which seems to consist chiefly of creating a website containing the agendas, minutes, decisions taken, clearance letters, violations, actions taken, court cases and coastal zone management plans for each state. Despite the welcome reversal of the earlier regulation regime, several of the new features of 2011 CRZ notification remains points of concerns for fish workers, coastal communities and environmentalists, leaving undefined as they do the precise nature and degree of community control and the concessions made to industry. While mention is made of the need to protect the livelihoods of fisherfolk community, there is no attempt to institutionalize community rights along the lines demanded by the National Campaign for Protection of Coast and expressed in public hearings. The amendments and violations to the earlier CRZ have not been reversed, and the monitoring and regulation mechanisms to prevent further violations remain weak. The institutionalization of fish workers and community rights and knowledge is fought for over decades of campaigns around marine and coastal regulation thus remains elusive. Thanks.